Good evening, dear listener. I am Professor Salamander, and tonight I offer you a riddle. What awakens only when forgotten, and grows stronger the longer it sleeps? Within the ancient halls of Hogwarts, where stone remembers more than any living wizard, some secrets do not vanish with time. They wait. Beyond familiar corridors and candle-lit towers, something old has begun to stir. So settle by the fire, listen closely, and let us walk together into a mystery hidden beneath the castle itself. The night had settled over Hogwarts like a velvet curtain, soft and deceptive, hiding within its folds the kind of silence that never truly belonged to a place so full of magic. For even in stillness, the castle breathed with shifting staircases, whispering portraits, and the distant murmur of enchantments woven into stone older than memory itself. Yet on this particular evening, something subtle had changed, something so faint that no spell could have easily revealed it, and yet so present that those who listened closely might have felt it threading through the corridors like a cold draft that had no origin. Professor Minerva McGonagall stood at the tall window of her office, her sharp eyes fixed upon the dark grounds where the forbidden forest stretched like a sleeping beast. And although she had lived through wars, betrayals, and the return of darkness itself, there was a tension in her posture that suggested this was something different, something quieter, and perhaps more dangerous precisely because it did not announce itself with obvious malice, but instead crept forward in silence, unnoticed by most. The trouble had begun earlier that day, though at first it seemed insignificant, almost dismissible as a mere fainting spell, when a Slytherin student collapsed during potions, his cauldron still bubbling softly beside him as though nothing had happened. And yet when he was brought to the hospital wing, his condition puzzled even Madame Pomfrey, for there were no signs of poison, no curse residue, no magical backlash, only a strange weakness that seemed to drain not the body, but something deeper, something tied to the very essence of who he was. By evening, 2 more students had been admitted, each from old wizarding families, each showing the same inexplicable symptoms. And though rumors began to ripple through the corridors in hushed voices and worried glances, the teachers maintained a calm facade, insisting that everything was under control, even as unease quietly took root among them. In the Gryffindor common room, the fire crackled warmly, casting golden light across the stone walls as a small group of students sat closer than usual, their voices low, their expressions serious in a way that did not belong to ordinary school gossip, for they had seen one of the affected students carried away, his face pale and his eyes unfocused, and something about it had unsettled them more than any ordinary illness could have. "It wasn't just fainting," one of them whispered, leaning forward as though the shadows themselves might be listening. "He looked like something was being taken from him, like he was fading." Another shook their head, trying to dismiss the thought, yet unable to fully shake the unease, because deep down they had felt it too, that strange, creeping wrongness that did not fit within the usual rules of magic they had been taught. And it was precisely that uncertainty that made it more frightening. High above them, in her office, McGonagall turned away from the window at last, her mind already moving through possibilities with the precision of a seasoned strategist, for she knew better than to ignore patterns. And 3 students from old bloodlines falling ill in a single day was no coincidence, no matter how subtle the cause might appear, and though she did not yet have proof, a single, troubling thought had begun to form in her mind, one that reached back into darker chapters of wizarding history, where magic had been used not merely as a tool, but as a weapon tied to lineage itself. She moved to her desk, pulling open a drawer that had not been touched in years, and from within she withdrew a thin, dust-covered book, its cover unmarked, its pages filled with records that few would have reason to consult in modern times, for it contained references to ancient curses long thought lost or forbidden, magic that did not simply target individuals, but entire bloodlines, binding fate to ancestry in ways that were as cruel as they were complex. As her fingers brushed against the worn pages, a faint chill passed through the room, though whether it came from the night air or from the knowledge contained within the book itself, even she could not have said. Meanwhile, far below the castle, in corridors long abandoned and rarely spoken of, something stirred. It was not alive in the way creatures were alive, nor conscious in the way a wizard might think, yet it possessed a presence, a lingering echo of intent that had been placed there long ago with purpose and precision, waiting not for time, but for the right conditions to awaken once more. And now, after years of silence, it had begun to respond, slowly, deliberately, as though recognizing that something had disturbed the fragile balance that had kept it dormant. Back in the castle above, the students in the common room eventually fell silent, each lost in their own thoughts, while outside the wind whispered faintly against the windows, carrying with it a sense of something approaching, something unseen, and though none of them could have named it, they all felt it in the same quiet, unspoken way. That night, as Hogwarts slept, the first thread of the curse tightened, and no one yet understood what had truly begun. Morning came to Hogwarts beneath a sky of pale silver, and though the first light spread itself across the high towers and along the black surface of the lake with all the ordinary grace of autumn dawn, there remained within the castle a strain of unease so fine and constant that it seemed woven into the very air, for word of the strange collapses had traveled farther in the night than any teacher had intended, passing from dormitory to dormitory in frightened whispers, growing with each telling, until by breakfast the great hall, despite its shining candles and drifting owls, no longer felt like a place of comfort, but rather like a chamber in which everyone was pretending, with visible effort, that ordinary school life still remained intact. At the Gryffindor table, conversations rose and fell in nervous currents, and every few moments someone glanced toward the staff table where Professor McGonagall sat straighter than ever, her face composed in the stern and controlled manner that had steadied generations of students, though those who knew her well enough might have noticed that she had barely touched the tea before her, and that her gaze moved not with casual oversight, but with the alertness of someone measuring danger concealed beneath familiar appearances. Among the students watching her were 3 seventh years who had not intended, when they arrived for breakfast, to involve themselves in anything more serious than unfinished homework and speculation about the next Hogsmeade weekend. Yet the events of the previous day had planted in them the kind of restless curiosity that does not easily loosen its grip, especially in a castle where mystery had so often proven to be the first sign of real peril. Elias Rowan, a Gryffindor with an inconvenient habit of noticing details other people overlooked, sat with one elbow near his untouched porridge and turned a brass spoon slowly between his fingers while his eyes followed the movements of the teachers. Across from him sat Miriam Vale, sharp-minded and careful, whose greatest talent was not in charms, as many believed, but in the quiet discipline with which she separated rumor from fact. And beside her, tearing absent-minded pieces from a roll he did not eat, was Theo Fairbairn, a Ravenclaw who had somehow become their closest friend over the years through a shared fondness for old books, late-night theories, and trouble that always seemed, however unfairly, to find them. "It is worse today," Miriam murmured, keeping her voice low enough that it vanished beneath the hum of the hall. "And do not tell me that is my imagination, because 3 people at this table have looked toward the hospital wing doors more times than they have looked at their plates. Theo gave the smallest nod, though his expression remained fixed on the staff table. 2 more students were taken there before breakfast, he said, and the fact that he knew it at all suggested he had already been gathering information before sunrise. Both from Hufflepuff, both from old families, and one of them was perfectly fine last night. Elias stopped turning the spoon. So it is not house-based, not class-based, and not linked to one place in the castle, he said, the pattern assembling itself already in his mind with increasing disquiet. Which means whatever this is, it chooses people rather than rooms. That sentence, once spoken, seemed to remain hanging between them with an unpleasant solidity, because it gave shape to what all 3 had already suspected, and none had wished to say plainly. And for a few moments they fell silent, each glancing without meaning to toward the Slytherin table, where several students sat rigid with contained fear, their usual self-possession strained by the knowledge that the first victim had come from among them. At the far end of the hall, Professor McGonagall rose. The sound of benches and voices softened almost at once, not because she called for silence, but because she so seldom needed to. And when she spoke, her voice carried with clean authority to every corner of the room. "I will say only this," she began, and though the words were measured, there was no gentleness in them, only steadiness. "The school is aware of the incidents that occurred yesterday and this morning, and all appropriate steps are being taken to ensure the safety of every student in this castle. Therefore, I expect discipline, calm, and the immediate reporting of any unusual symptoms, magical disturbances, or suspicious objects." Her gaze moved across the tables like a drawn blade. "Let no one turn ignorance into amusement, nor fear into invention, because either may prove dangerous." With that, she sat, and the ordinary noise of breakfast resumed, though more quietly than before, while Elias felt the first real certainty settle in his thoughts, namely that McGonagall was worried enough to address the entire school, which meant the matter was already beyond the reach of routine explanation. By midday, the corridors had become places of watchful tension, where every cluster of students seemed thinner than usual, as though no one wished to be too far from witnesses should something happen, and the castle itself, perhaps only in imagination, appeared different to those who walked through it, because once the mind has accepted that danger may be hidden in familiar walls, even ordinary shadows begin to look deliberate. After Transfiguration, Elias, Miriam, and Theo made their way toward the library under the pretense of revising, though all 3 knew perfectly well that none of them intended to spend the afternoon on coursework. For there existed among students of a certain disposition an unspoken law stronger than caution, and it held that when adults began withholding information in a castle full of ancient secrets, someone curious enough would always begin searching for the rest. Madame Pince gave them the severe look she reserved for groups whose innocence she mistrusted on principle, yet because they asked for no restricted texts and made no obvious disturbance, she permitted them to settle at a table beneath the high windows, where light from the cloudy sky fell in cold bands across the wood. Theo had already begun assembling a stack of books related to magical maladies, hereditary enchantments, and obscure defensive practices, while Miriam took notes with swift, elegant precision, and Elias scanned an index on medieval countercurses with growing impatience, because what he was looking for was not yet a name, but the shape of one. It was Miriam who found the first useful thread. "This," she said, and her voice had changed in the way it did whenever she had come upon something genuinely troubling. "Listen to this carefully." She turned the book toward them, pressing one finger against a passage half hidden by age-darkened binding. "In rare and unlawful branches of blood magic," she read softly, "there exist forms of affliction designed not to wound flesh directly, but to weaken the living magical inheritance carried through a family line, thereby causing collapse, magical depletion, fever, and eventual death if the binding source remains active." Theo exhaled through his teeth. Elias said nothing at all. Miriam looked from one to the other. "This cannot be coincidence." "No," Theo said, his usual composure fraying now that the thing had a category. "And if this is blood magic, then we are not dealing with an accident, because these curses are not cast carelessly, and they do not wake without cause." Elias leaned over the passage, his eyes moving faster as he read the lines surrounding it, until another phrase caught him with sudden force. "Binding source," he repeated, and the words came colder than before, "which means the curse is attached to something." Something in the library shifted just then, not visibly, but in the way a room alters when a thought becomes true. And though no candle flickered and no shelf creaked, all three felt the same quick tightening in the chest, because an unknown curse was one thing, but a curse anchored to an object somewhere inside Hogwarts was another, and far more dangerous, for objects may be hidden, carried, admired, misplaced, or touched by countless unsuspecting hands. Theo shut the book more quickly than Madame Pince would have appreciated. "Then the question is not simply who is being targeted," he said, rising already, "but what entered this castle recently, and should never have been here at all." As they left the library, they did not see the dark figure standing motionless in the alcove beyond the nearest arch, nor the gloved hand that tightened ever so slightly around a polished wooden cane, because whoever watched them had stepped back beyond the reach of light, with the practiced stillness of someone who knew the value of listening before acting. And somewhere, in stone chambers older than any map the students had ever seen, the hidden force beneath Hogwarts stirred once more, now stronger than before, as if pleased that at last someone had begun to understand the game it meant to play. By the time the afternoon shadows stretched long across the corridors of Hogwarts, Elias, Miriam, and Theo had already crossed from uneasy speculation into the far more dangerous territory of deliberate investigation. For once the idea of a hidden object had taken root in their minds, it refused to be dismissed as mere theory, instead pressing upon them with increasing urgency, as though the very act of recognizing its existence had drawn them into the slow, tightening orbit of the curse itself. They moved through the castle not as wandering students, but with purpose carefully disguised as routine, passing between staircases that shifted with their usual stubborn unpredictability, descending corridors that seemed quieter than before, and pausing often under the pretense of conversation while their eyes searched for anything out of place, anything new, anything that did not belong to the long, familiar rhythm of Hogwarts life. "What we need," Theo murmured as they paused beside a window overlooking the courtyard, "is not just a list of recent objects, because students bring things in all the time, but something unusual enough to pass unnoticed by most, and yet significant enough to carry a binding curse." Miriam folded her arms, her brow drawn in thought. "It would have to be old," she said slowly, "because blood magic of that kind is rarely modern, and whoever created it would have tied it to something that could endure for years without being disturbed." Elias glanced toward the stone below, where a few students crossed the courtyard in small, uneasy groups. "Or something that was meant to be found," he added, and the moment he spoke, both of them looked at him sharply, because that possibility altered everything. "Explain," Theo said. Elias straightened slightly, his mind moving faster now as the pieces aligned. "If you wanted a curse like this to activate again after a long time," he said, choosing his words carefully. "You would not hide the object so deeply that no one could ever reach it, because then it would never serve its purpose. Instead, you would place it somewhere it might be discovered eventually, somewhere it would be mistaken for something harmless, something even valuable." Miriam's expression darkened with understanding. "Something that invites curiosity. Or possession," Theo added quietly. For a moment, none of them spoke, because the implication was as clear as it was unsettling, namely that the object might already be in the hands of someone within the castle, perhaps even someone unaware of what they carried, and that each passing hour brought the curse further into motion. They turned from the window and continued on, descending toward the lower levels where fewer students wandered during the day, and where the air carried that faint, cool stillness that seemed to belong to older parts of the castle, parts that had seen generations pass without changing. And as they moved, Elias felt again that subtle sensation from the previous night, the sense that something beneath the surface of Hogwarts was not merely present, but aware. It was Miriam who broke the silence this time. "There is another detail," she said, her voice quieter than before, as though speaking it aloud might give it weight. "All the victims so far come from old wizarding families, which means the curse is not random, but selective, and that suggests it recognizes bloodlines rather than individuals." Theo gave a short, uneasy breath. "Which means the object is not just dangerous," he said. "It is specific." "And that," Elias replied, "means it was created with intent." They reached a narrow passage that curved downward toward an older section of the castle, one rarely used except by those who had reason to seek quiet or secrecy. And as they stepped into its dimmer light, the sounds of the upper corridors faded behind them until their footsteps echoed more sharply against the stone. At the far end of the passage stood a suit of armor, ancient and unmoving, its metal dulled with age, yet it was not the armor itself that drew their attention, but the faint mark on the wall beside it, a scratch that looked recent, as though something had been dragged or shifted against the stone not long ago. Elias stopped at once. "Do you see that?" he asked, though he already knew they did. Theo stepped closer, crouching slightly to examine the mark, while Miriam glanced back along the corridor, as though measuring how often this place was used. "This section is not part of any main route," she said, her voice tight with thought, "which means anyone bringing something here would not be interrupted easily." Theo ran his fingers lightly over the stone, then pulled them back. "Dust disturbed," he murmured, "not more than a day or two." Elias felt a slow tightening in his chest, not of fear exactly, but of recognition, because this was the first tangible sign that their suspicion might be more than theory. "Then we are not imagining it," he said. "No," Miriam replied. "We are following it." For a moment they hesitated, not out of doubt, but because the line between curiosity and danger had become unmistakably clear, and crossing it meant accepting that whatever they found next might not be something they could easily walk away from. Then Theo rose to his feet. "Well," he said with a faint attempt at steadiness, "if this is where it leads, then we either turn back now and pretend we never saw it, or we continue and find out what has already begun." Elias looked once more at the scratch on the wall, then at the darkened passage beyond. "Someone has already brought something here," he said, and his voice, though quiet, carried a certainty that left no room for retreat. "And if we leave it, more people will fall." Miriam gave a single nod. "Then we do not leave it." Together they stepped forward, moving past the armor and into the deeper corridor beyond, where the light thinned and the air grew colder. And though none of them spoke again, each carried the same unspoken thought, namely that they were no longer merely searching for answers, but approaching the very heart of whatever had been awakened beneath Hogwarts. Behind them, unnoticed and silent, the armor shifted ever so slightly, not enough to be seen, but enough that its shadow bent against the wall in a way that did not match the flickering torchlight. And somewhere far below, the hidden force pulsed once more, stronger now, as though welcoming those who came closer to its source. The corridor into which they now advanced seemed to resist them not through any visible enchantment, but through a subtler quality that settled over their senses like a weight, for the air grew steadily colder with each step, and the torchlight along the walls flickered with an irregular rhythm that did not quite align with any natural draft, as though the flames themselves were reacting to something unseen moving through the stone. And though none of the three spoke of it aloud, each felt with increasing clarity that they had crossed into a part of Hogwarts that did not welcome casual passage. Elias led by half a pace, not because he was braver than the others, but because he had already committed himself to the path forward in a way that made turning back feel more dangerous than continuing, while behind him, Theo kept one hand near his wand and the other brushing lightly along the wall, as though the contact might anchor him against whatever intangible presence pressed inward from the dark. And Miriam walked last, her gaze moving constantly, not only ahead but behind and above, measuring space, sound, and silence with the instinct of someone who understood that danger in places like this rarely announced itself from a single direction. The passage curved gently downward until it opened into a narrow chamber where the ceiling lowered and the walls bore marks of age far deeper than those in the upper corridors. For here the stone was not merely worn, but scarred in places, etched faintly with symbols that had long since faded into near invisibility, and yet remained just distinct enough that the mind recognized them as deliberate, not accidental. Remnants of magic worked in a time when Hogwarts had been less cautious in what it permitted to exist within its foundations. Theo was the first to notice them. "Those are not decorative," he said quietly, his voice carrying an edge that had not been there before, as he stepped closer to the wall and traced one of the faint carvings without touching it. "And they are not recent either, which means whatever this place was used for, it predates most of the castle as we know it." Miriam leaned in beside him, narrowing her eyes. "They are not runes in any common system," she said after a moment, "but they follow a structure, repeating shapes, slight variations, almost like markers." "Markers for what?" Elias asked, though even as he spoke, a thought had already begun to form. Theo answered it before Miriam could. "For boundaries," he said, and when he turned, there was no uncertainty in his expression, only a growing realization that tightened his voice. "This is not just a corridor. It is part of something larger, something contained." Elias felt that same recognition settle into place, heavy and unwelcome. "A chamber," he said. "Or something beneath it," Miriam added. They moved further in, their footsteps echoing more sharply now, until the chamber narrowed once more into a passage that descended more steeply. And as they followed it, the temperature dropped enough that their breath began to mist faintly in the air, while the torches behind them seemed to dim, not extinguished, but distant, as though the light itself was reluctant to follow them deeper. At last, the passage ended. Before them stood a door. It was not large, nor grand, nor marked with any obvious sign of importance, yet there was about it a stillness so complete that it seemed to exist apart from the rest of the castle. A surface of dark stone set perfectly into the wall, without handle, without hinge, and without any visible means of opening, and yet it was unmistakably a door because the space around it held that quiet tension that belongs only to something meant to be crossed. For several moments, none of them moved. "This is it," Theo said at last, though his voice had dropped to almost nothing. Miriam nodded slowly. "If the object is anywhere," she said, "it is beyond that." Elias stepped closer, his eyes moving over the surface, searching for any sign, any clue that might reveal how it had been opened before, because the mark they had found in the corridor above had not been random, and something had passed through here recently, something or someone who had known how to enter. "There has to be a mechanism," he said, more to himself than to the others, as he ran his gaze along the edges where the stone met the wall. Or a trigger, something tied to the magic of the place. Theo lifted his wand slightly. "We could try a revealing charm," he suggested, though even as he spoke, there was hesitation in his tone, because magic used blindly in places like this often yielded results far less predictable than intended. Miriam shook her head at once. "Not yet," she said firmly. "If this door is part of a binding structure, then forcing it might activate something we cannot undo." Elias paused, considering, then nodded, because she was right, and the last thing they needed was to worsen a curse they barely understood. Instead, he placed his hand lightly against the stone. At first, nothing happened. Then, faintly, almost imperceptibly, he felt it. A pulse. It was not warmth, nor vibration, nor any physical sensation that could be easily described, but rather a subtle shift, as though something beneath the surface had recognized the contact, responding not to the touch itself, but to the presence behind it, to the blood, the lineage, the unseen thread that connected a person to everything that had come before them. Elias pulled his hand back sharply. "It reacts," he said, his voice tighter now, "not to spells, but to us." Theo's eyes widened slightly. "Then it is keyed to blood," he said, and there was no mistaking the significance of that conclusion. Miriam stepped closer, her expression intent despite the unease that now shadowed it. "Try again," she said quietly. "But this time, do not just touch it. Focus on the connection, on the idea of who you are." Elias hesitated only a moment, then placed his hand against the stone once more, this time allowing his mind to settle, not on fear, but on the steady awareness of his own existence, the quiet certainty of identity that lies beneath thought and action alike. For a heartbeat, nothing changed. Then the door moved. Not with sound, nor with visible motion at first, but with a shift so smooth and silent that it seemed less like opening and more like absence, as though the stone itself withdrew into nothing. Revealing a darkness beyond that did not reflect the torchlight behind them. A breath of colder air flowed outward. Theo swallowed. Miriam did not move. Elias stepped back. "We found it," he said. But even as the words left him, a deeper realization followed close behind, one that settled over all three of them with quiet, undeniable weight. They had not simply found the source. They had opened it. And somewhere within the darkness beyond that threshold, the curse stirred in response, no longer dormant, no longer waiting, but awake. Beyond the opened threshold, there lay not a room in any ordinary sense, but a long, hidden chamber whose silence possessed such depth that it seemed less an absence of sound than the survival of an ancient intention, preserved intact through years, perhaps centuries. Beneath the living castle above, and when Elias, Miriam, and Theo crossed into it with the cautious steps of those who already suspected they had trespassed upon something dangerous, The darkness within did not immediately yield to the thin light from their wands, but gathered itself stubbornly in the corners and along the ceiling, as though reluctant to surrender what it had kept concealed for so very long. The floor sloped slightly downward, and the stone beneath their feet was smoother than in the corridor outside, worn not by age alone, but by the passage of those who had once come here with purpose. And on either side of the chamber stood narrow pillars carved with the same faded symbols they had seen before, though here the marks were clearer, deeper, and arranged in deliberate sequences that suggested ritual rather than architecture, while between the pillars ran channels cut into the floor, shallow and dark. Converging toward the far end of the chamber, where something rose upon a low dais. For several breaths, none of them spoke, because the chamber itself demanded silence, and because the thing on the dais had already fixed their attention with the quiet force of an answer long feared and finally found. It was a basin of black stone, no wider than a large cauldron, set upon a plinth shaped like intertwined serpents and hawks, their bodies carved so tightly together that one could scarcely tell where one ended and the other began. And above the basin hovered a thin shimmer in the air, almost invisible until one looked directly at it, like heat over summer rock, except that the sensation it gave was not warmth, but the exact opposite, a cold pressure that seemed to reach toward them with patient recognition. Theo stopped so suddenly that Elias nearly stepped into him. "That," he said, and the steadiness of his voice now seemed forced, "is the binding source." Miriam's eyes had already moved to the channels in the floor. "Those grooves," she whispered, "they all lead to the basin." Elias followed the lines with his gaze and felt a chill deepen beneath his ribs, because what had first appeared to be simple carved channels now revealed itself as something much worse, something designed to carry not water nor potion, but ritual substance. And given the nature of the curse they were confronting, there was no need to say aloud what that substance had once been intended to be. "This was built for blood magic," he said at last, and though he kept his voice low, the chamber seemed to catch the words and hold them, making them feel heavier than when spoken elsewhere. Theo took a step to the side, examining the walls, and as he moved, the light of his wand passed over old metal brackets, broken chains, and fragments of inscriptions set into the stone, some too worn to read, others still just visible enough to suggest names, family marks, and oath signs from wizarding houses so old that most students would know them only from history texts or forgotten genealogies. Miriam moved toward the dais, though cautiously, her wand raised, while Elias remained half-turned, watching not only the basin, but the shadows around it, because the whole chamber felt alive with the residue of intent, as though whatever had been done here had not truly ended, but merely paused. "There is writing on the rim," Miriam said. Theo came at once, and Elias joined them, all three bending slightly to read the narrow band of words etched into the black stone, their letters so fine and ancient that they seemed at first little more than cracks. Theo spoke first, translating slowly as his eyes followed the script. "Let the debt of blood fall not upon the betrayer alone," he murmured, "but upon the root from which he rose, and upon the branch that bears his name thereafter." No one said anything for several seconds. It was not merely a curse, then, nor even a punishment directed at a single victim, but vengeance given magical form, a design meant to outlive the original crime and descend through generations, striking descendants who may have known nothing of the act for which they suffered, and the cruelty of it was so complete that even within the long, dark history of wizarding violence, it felt singular. Theo read on, more quietly now. "Bound in witness, sealed in lineage, sleeping until called by token. Elias lifted his head. Called by token, he repeated, and the meaning struck him with immediate force, the object that reactivated it. Miriam nodded once. The object was not the curse itself, she said, thinking quickly now. It was the key. Theo's face had gone paler in the wand light. Which means whoever brought it into Hogwarts may not have known what it was, only that it belonged here, or that it opened something. Before Elias could answer, a sound reached them from somewhere beyond the chamber. It was slight, no more than a scrape against stone, yet in the silence it seemed shockingly loud. All three turned at once, wands raised. Nothing moved in the doorway behind them. Nothing stood between the pillars. Nothing, at least, that the eye could immediately name. Then the shimmer above the basin changed. It thickened. The air over the black stone twisted as though stirred by an invisible hand. And within that distortion forms began to gather, not solid, not fully present, but suggestive of faces, hands, robes, a crowd seen through deep water, and though none of the figures could be clearly distinguished, the emotion carried with them was unmistakable because it struck not the eyes first, but the nerves, a pulse of grief, fury, accusation, and long-preserved hatred. Theo took a step back. They left an imprint, he said hoarsely, the ritual-preserved echoes. One of the shapes leaned forward from the wavering air, and for a moment Elias thought he saw the outline of a woman with severe features and hollow eyes, her hand raised as though in warning or command, though whether she addressed them or someone long dead, he could not tell. Then the basin itself answered. From within the black stone came a glow, dark red and unsteady, filling the carved letters one by one until the inscription blazed faintly around the rim, while the channels in the floor began to pulse in the same dull crimson light, carrying the glow outward like veins awakening beneath skin. Miriam's breath caught. We triggered it further by opening the chamber. Elias stared at the spreading light, his thoughts racing. No, he said, and the realization came cold and sharp. Not just by opening it, by entering as blooded descendants of old houses. Theo looked at him. You mean it recognized us? Yes, Elias replied, and now that he had spoken it, he knew it to be true. It was waiting for contact from living lineage. The chamber responded again, as if in confirmation. A low sound rose around them, not a voice, not wind, but something between the two. A murmur formed from many overlapping whispers too ancient and too fractured to make out, and with it came a pressure in Elias's chest so sudden and severe that he staggered, grabbing the edge of the dais to steady himself. Miriam swayed beside him, one hand pressed to her ribs, while Theo's wand arm dropped slightly as though weakened. The curse was not merely awake. It was feeding. We have to leave, Miriam said through clenched teeth, though every word seemed harder to force out than the one before it. Elias tried to straighten, but the weakness deepened, strange and invasive, not like ordinary pain or spell damage, but a draining from within, as though some hidden thread connected to the basin had found its way into him and was drawing steadily at something deeper than strength. Theo, still pale, pointed toward the far wall. There, he whispered. Set into the stone behind the basin, revealed now by the red glow, was a carved recess they had not noticed before, and within it rested a single object upon a narrow shelf of black rock. It was a ring. Not a jewel-bright ornament of the sort worn for vanity, but an old family signet of heavy dark gold, its crest half scratched away, its stone cracked through the center as though by heat or curse fire, and yet even damaged it carried a presence that seized the eye at once. Because one did not need explanation to know that this was the token named in the inscription, the thing that had called the sleeping curse back into motion. Miriam looked from the ring to the basin, and understood before either of the others spoke. "That was brought here recently," she said, "placed back where it belonged." Elias forced himself upright despite the worsening weakness. Then someone did know enough to do this. The whispering around them grew louder, and from the doorway behind them came another sound, this time unmistakable. Footsteps. Slow, measured, approaching without hurry, as though the one who made them had known all along that eventually someone else would find the chamber and saw no reason to fear that discovery. Theo turned first, wand lifting again despite the tremor in his hand. A tall figure emerged from the shadow beyond the pillars, robed in black, one gloved hand resting lightly upon a polished cane, and though the face was partly veiled by darkness, the posture carried neither panic nor surprise, only the calm of someone arriving precisely at the moment intended. For a heartbeat, none of the three moved. Then the figure stepped into the red glow of the chamber, and Elias felt the air leave his lungs. Because the man standing before them was not a stranger, and that made everything far worse. The man who stepped fully into the crimson half-light of the chamber bore himself with the severe composure of someone long accustomed to cold rooms, grave responsibilities, and the burden of carrying knowledge that could not be spoken carelessly. And though the change time had worked upon him was unmistakable in the silver at his temples, the deeper lines beside his mouth, and the restrained weariness in his eyes, there could be no doubt at all as to who he was, for his face was known to every student at Hogwarts, not as a teacher, nor as a ministry official, but as one of those rare figures whose name belonged equally to history and living memory. It was Draco Malfoy. For several moments, the chamber held all four of them in a silence so taut that even the whispering curse seemed, if not stilled, then listening. And Elias, though the weakness pressing through his chest had not loosened, found himself staring with the same startled disbelief that had fixed Theo and Miriam where they stood. Because however many explanations the mind might offer in the abstract, none seemed adequate when confronted with the simple, impossible fact of Draco Malfoy standing beneath Hogwarts in secret, before a blood curse newly awakened, looking neither shocked nor lost, but grimly prepared. Theo recovered first, though only enough to raise his wand higher. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, and his voice, despite the strain that dragged at it, cut sharply through the chamber. Malfoy's gaze moved from one to the next of them, assessing, measuring, and perhaps, in some quiet corner of himself, regretting that he had arrived too late to prevent exactly this. "You opened the chamber," he said, and his tone was calm, though not gentle, which was the one thing I had hoped no student would manage. Miriam's face hardened at once. "That is not an answer." "No," Malfoy replied, and now his eyes shifted toward the basin, where the red-lit inscription glowed like an old wound reopened. "It is a consequence." Elias stepped slightly in front of the others, not out of heroism, but because something in Malfoy's presence, controlled though it was, suggested that this was no accidental visit, and all the fragments they had gathered until now suddenly bent toward a terrible, obvious question. "You knew about this place," he said. Malfoy did not deny it. "Yes," he answered after a moment, and the word entered the chamber with the weight of a door closing. Theo's wand did not waver. Then you brought the ring." At that, something changed in Malfoy's expression. Not surprise, but the smallest recognition that they had reached the correct conclusion faster than he might have expected. "Yes," he said again. The whispering around the chamber seemed to rise at that confession, as though the curse itself took satisfaction in hearing the truth acknowledged at last. And Miriam, whose face had gone pale not only from the draining force in the room, but from the shape of what she now understood, took one sharp breath before speaking. "Then this is your fault." Malfoy's jaw tightened, and for the first time since entering, he looked not merely composed, but tired, in a way that belonged to failures carried too long. "It is," he said quietly, "though not in the way you imagine." The red light from the basin deepened, creeping along the channels in the floor and throwing hard shadows against the pillars, while the shapes above the black stone thickened once more into those half-formed impressions of robed figures, witnesses from another age watching through the residue of their own hatred. And Elias, though every instinct urged him to demand explanations all at once, understood with sudden clarity that anger would not help them if the curse had already begun feeding from their presence. Then Malfoy spoke again, this time more quickly. "You will listen now, because every minute you remain in this chamber strengthens the binding, and however much you may wish to accuse me before hearing the rest, indignation will be of little use when you collapse before reaching the stairs." There was enough truth in that to cut through outrage, because Elias could feel the weakness spreading through his arms, and Theo's breathing had become shallower, while Miriam kept one hand pressed tightly against the edge of the dais, as though to stop herself from swaying, and so, though none of them lowered their wands, they allowed silence to stand where interruption might have gone. Malfoy moved no closer to them, but neither did he retreat, and when he spoke again, his voice carried none of the arrogance that had once defined his schoolboy years, only precision, fatigue, and a reluctance born not from secrecy for its own sake, but from knowledge that the truth would sound unbelievable even when told plainly. "The ring belonged to House Selwyn before the family split into lesser branches 2 centuries ago," he said, his gaze settling not on them now, but on the cracked signet resting in the recess behind the basin. And during a feud so vicious that much of it was deliberately omitted from public records, one branch betrayed another to the ministry of the time, not for law, not for justice, but for property, title, and extinction by legal pretense, after which the surviving members of the ruined line turned to blood magic in an attempt to ensure that the victors would never truly escape what they had done. Theo swallowed. "They built this." "No," said Malfoy, and the correction came at once. "They completed it, but the chamber was older even then, one of several ritual spaces beneath Hogwarts sealed after practices once tolerated became too dangerous to remain accessible." Miriam's eyes narrowed. "And the curse was tied to the Selwyn line." "To those descended from the betraying branch, and to several allied houses bound to them by marriage and oath," Malfoy said, "which is why the victims are not from a single family, but from old pure-blood lines connected across generations." Elias felt the thought strike him before he fully understood why. "And the Malfoys?" For the first time, Malfoy looked directly at him. "Yes," he said, and in that single syllable there lay both inheritance and condemnation. "Through marriage on my grandmother's side, distantly enough that most would not notice the link, closely enough that this chamber does." The truth fell over them like cold water. This was not merely a secret curse hidden under Hogwarts, nor only an old crime resurfacing through modern descendants, but a curse that had touched the Malfoy family itself, which meant Draco Malfoy had not come here as an observer, a scholar, or even a reckless intruder drawn by dangerous curiosity, but as someone whose own blood answered to the magic in the room. "You reactivated it by accident," Elias said slowly, piecing it together. "You found the ring and brought it here because you thought it was connected, but you did not know what it would do." A shadow crossed Malfoy's face. "I knew enough to fear it," he said, "but not enough to understand the mechanism fully, because the family records were incomplete, contradictory, and deliberately obscured, which I ought to have taken as warning enough, except that an object tied to a sealed blood ritual chamber beneath a school full of descendants of old houses is not the sort of problem one leaves uninvestigated once discovered." Theo's mouth tightened. "So you came alone?" "Yes." "And you opened it?" A pause. "Yes." Miriam closed her eyes briefly, less from disbelief now than from the sheer weight of consequences created by a single misjudged act. "When?" "3 nights ago," Malfoy said, after receiving the ring from a private estate sale that included artifacts recovered from a ruined branch property in Wiltshire, because the crest, though damaged, matched fragments from family correspondence I had been reviewing. And when I brought it here, the chamber responded. The ring returned to its place, and the curse woke slowly, far more slowly than it has since the 4 of us entered together. Elias felt anger rise again, not because the explanation lacked coherence, but because it possessed too much of it, and because its dreadful reasonableness made the danger no less real. "You should have gone to McGonagall." At that, Malfoy's expression altered, and something almost like self-contempt flashed there before being mastered. "Yes," he said, "I should have, and I intended to after confirming the chamber's function, except that the first student collapsed the following day, and by then I had spent one fatal evening hoping I might close what I had opened without involving the school." The basin answered as though in judgment. The crimson glow surged suddenly brighter, and all 4 of them flinched as the whispering rose into a layered hiss, while the shapes above the stone twisted and merged until one face emerged more clearly than the rest. A gaunt woman with deep-set eyes and a mouth drawn thin with old fury, and when she seemed to turn toward Malfoy, the air in the room tightened with such force that Elias nearly dropped to one knee. Malfoy gripped his cane harder, but did not look away. "She was the one who made the final binding," he said through clenched teeth. "Not to them exactly, but to the room, to the chamber, to the dead. Ariana Selwyn, daughter of the ruined line, and according to what remains of the records, she swore that no descendant of the betrayers would know peace until the debt was acknowledged in blood and relinquished in power." Theo's voice came rough with pain. "Relinquished in power means what?" Malfoy looked at him, and for the first time there was no reserve left in his answer. "It means the curse cannot be broken by counterspell alone," he said, "because it is not only a weapon, but a contract, and contracts such as this end only when the bound line surrenders something of inherited magic in exchange for release." Miriam stared at him. "You mean a sacrifice?" "Yes." The word entered the chamber and seemed to awaken every shadow. Elias felt his stomach turn cold. "A sacrifice of what?" Malfoy's eyes shifted once more to the basin, the ring, the red-lit channels that fed toward it like veins around a heart. "Of blood-bound inheritance," he said, and his voice, though quiet, contained the full gravity of the horror, which, in practical terms, means that someone from the linked lines must give up a portion of family magic permanently, enough to satisfy the oath and close the chamber, or the curse will continue taking it by force from every descendant it can reach until there is nothing left to feed upon. Silence followed, But it was no longer the silence of uncertainty. Now it was the silence of understanding. Because the conflict before them had at last taken its final shape, stark and merciless, and each of them knew, without saying so, that the outcome would not be won by courage alone, nor by cleverness, nor even by simply surviving the night, but by choosing who would pay the ancient debt, and what would remain of that person after the payment was made. For a long and terrible moment, no one spoke, because the meaning of what had just been revealed did not merely settle into their thoughts, but pressed upon them with the weight of inevitability, and the chamber itself seemed to respond to that understanding with a subtle tightening of its crimson-lit air, as though the curse, having at last been acknowledged for what it truly was, had no further need to conceal its demands behind confusion or delay. Elias felt the weakness within him deepen, not in a sudden collapse, but in a slow, steady draining that made every movement heavier than the last. And when he glanced toward Miriam and Theo, he saw the same strain etched into their faces, though each held it differently. Miriam with controlled stillness that masked the toll it was taking, and Theo with a flicker of restless tension, as though resisting the pull through sheer force of will. "This cannot be the only way," Miriam said at last, though the firmness in her voice now carried a trace of urgency that had not been there before. "Blood magic binds, yes, but it can also be redirected, unraveled, weakened through interruption of its structure. There must be a countermeasure that does not require surrendering part of one's own magic." Malfoy did not dismiss the thought outright, yet neither did he appear hopeful. "If there were," he said, "it would be recorded somewhere within the same branches of knowledge that preserved the curse itself, and I have searched those records as far as they still exist, which is to say, incompletely, inconsistently, and with deliberate omissions that make reconstruction unreliable at best." Theo's grip tightened around his wand. "So we are left with accepting the rules of a centuries-old curse created by someone who intended it to be inescapable," he said, and the frustration in his voice now edged toward anger, "which is precisely the sort of thing we should not accept without question." Elias, though he shared that instinct, forced himself to look again at the basin, at the glowing inscription, at the channels that pulsed with dark red light, and at the ring resting in its recess like a key returned to its lock, because whatever solution they found would not come from rejecting the reality before them, but from understanding it more completely than those who had created it. "The curse feeds on lineage," he said slowly, thinking aloud, "which means it recognizes identity through blood, not through intention, not through guilt, and not through knowledge of the original crime." Miriam turned toward him at once, catching the direction of his thought. "So the victims are not chosen because they deserve it, but because they belong to the network of names bound into the ritual." "Yes," Elias replied, "and if the curse is structured as a contract, then it must have terms, not just a demand." Theo frowned. "Terms that require payment." "Or recognition," Elias said. Malfoy's gaze sharpened slightly. "Explain." Elias stepped closer to the basin, though the pressure within his chest warned him that he was already near the limit of what he could endure in that place. Yet the need to understand outweighed the discomfort now, because every moment spent hesitating seemed to feed the curse further. "The inscription speaks of debt," he said, his eyes moving once more over the etched words, "and of the betrayer and the root and the branch, which means the curse was designed not only to punish, but to enforce acknowledgement of wrongdoing across generations. Otherwise, the creators would have simply designed a killing curse tied to bloodlines without conditions." Miriam nodded slowly, her mind following the same path. So the surrender of magic is not random, but symbolic. Exactly, Elias said, and now the shape of the idea grew clearer. It represents repayment, a relinquishing of what was taken or gained through the original betrayal. Theo's expression shifted, which implies that if the debt is acknowledged in another way, then the terms of the contract might be satisfied differently, Miriam finished, her voice gaining strength despite the strain in her body. Malfoy watched them in silence for a moment, then spoke with careful restraint. "That is not an unreasonable interpretation," he said, "but it assumes that the curse will accept an alternative form of fulfillment, which is not guaranteed in magic designed to enforce a specific outcome." Elias met his gaze. "It may not be guaranteed," he said, "but neither is the assumption that only one method exists simply because it is the one most clearly stated." The chamber seemed to react again, though not violently, but with a subtle shift in the red glow, as though the magic within it responded to the intensity of their focus, to the alignment of thought directed toward its structure, and the whispering rose and fell in patterns that almost, though not quite, resembled words. Miriam stepped closer to the basin, despite the obvious effort it cost her. "If this is a contract," she said, "then there must be a moment within the ritual where the terms are recognized, where the binding is reinforced, and if we can find that point, we might be able to alter how the recognition occurs." Theo exhaled sharply. "You mean rewrite part of the curse while it is active?" "Yes." "That is dangerously close to impossible." "Oh, so is sacrificing inherited magic without knowing what remains afterward," Miriam replied, and though her voice was quieter now, it carried a certainty that left little room for retreat. Malfoy's eyes moved once more to the basin, then to the ring, and finally back to the three of them. And for a brief instant the conflict within him showed plainly, not between right and wrong, but between caution and necessity, between the knowledge of how dangerous such an attempt would be and the equally undeniable fact that doing nothing would condemn more students with each passing hour. "The ritual anchor is the basin," he said at last, "and the ring functions as the activating token, but the true binding lies in the oath embedded within the structure of the chamber itself, carried through the symbols, the channels, and the accumulated residue of the original casting." Elias followed his gaze. "So if we are to alter anything, it must be at the point where the oath is recognized." "Yes," Malfoy said, "and that recognition is triggered by the presence of living bloodlines connected to the original participants." Theo looked between them. "Which means us." Miriam's hand tightened on the edge of the basin. "Which means we are already part of the ritual, whether we intend to be or not." The red light surged again, stronger now, and Elias felt a sharp pull within his chest that forced him to brace himself against the stone, while Theo staggered half a step back, and Miriam drew in a breath that sounded almost like a gasp. The curse was accelerating. "We are running out of time," Theo said. Elias forced himself upright, ignoring the growing weakness. "Then we choose quickly," he said, and though his voice was strained, it held firm. "Either we accept the original demand and sacrifice part of our inherited magic to end this now, or we attempt to alter the recognition of the debt and risk failing, which may strengthen the curse further." Miriam looked at him, then at Theo, then at Malfoy, and in that moment the three students understood with perfect clarity that whatever they chose would bind them not only to the outcome, but to each other, because none of them could stand within that chamber without being counted among those whose blood the curse recognized. Malfoy spoke again, more quietly than before. "If you attempt to alter it," he said, "you will need to engage directly with the oath, not merely observe it, which means placing yourselves within the point of recognition." Theo gave a short, humorless breath. "Which sounds remarkably like stepping into the heart of the curse." "It is," Malfoy said. Elias closed his eyes for the briefest moment, then opened them again. "Then that is what we do," he said, "because despite the danger, despite the uncertainty, and despite the cost that might still be demanded, he knew with unshakable certainty that accepting the original terms without question would mean allowing the past to dictate the present in the most absolute way possible, and that, more than anything, felt wrong. Miriam nodded, though the strain in her face had deepened. Theo hesitated only a second longer, then gave a tight, resolute nod as well. Malfoy watched them, and though he did not smile, there was in his expression something that had not been there before, something that might almost have been approval. Or perhaps simply recognition of a choice he himself had once failed to make in time. "Very well," he said. The chamber darkened around the edges as the red glow concentrated more intensely at the basin, and the whispering rose into a layered murmur that now pressed against their ears with near-voice clarity, though the words themselves remained just beyond comprehension. "Then prepare yourselves," Malfoy continued, his tone returning to controlled precision, "because once you begin, there will be no simple way to withdraw, and whatever the curse demands in response, it will take without hesitation." Elias stepped forward, Miriam beside him, Theo just behind, and together they approached the basin, the center of the chamber, the heart of the binding, where the ancient oath waited not for willingness, but for recognition. And as the red light flared brighter than before, the shadows gathered close, and the whispering voices leaned inward, as though the past itself had drawn breath in anticipation of what would come next. The moment Elias placed both hands upon the cold rim of the basin, the chamber responded not with hesitation, but with immediate and overwhelming recognition, as though the act itself had fulfilled a condition long awaited, and the crimson light surged upward in a violent bloom that swallowed the shadows and filled the space with a deep, pulsing glow, while the whispering that had until now lingered at the edge of hearing rose suddenly into something far more distinct. Not yet words, but no longer formless, pressing against their minds with an intensity that left no doubt that the curse had turned its full attention upon them. Miriam stepped forward without breaking contact, placing her own hand beside Elias's, her fingers tightening against the stone as though anchoring herself against the force gathering around them, while Theo, though a fraction slower, followed at once, his wand lowering as he pressed his palm against the basin as well, completing the contact that the ritual demanded. And in that instant, the connection between them and the chamber deepened, drawing them inward, not physically, but through a sensation that felt as though their very identities were being threaded into the structure of the curse itself. Malfoy remained just behind them, his gaze fixed upon the basin with a focus sharpened by urgency. Yet he did not interrupt, because he understood that this stage could not be guided by instruction alone, but required the participants to engage with the magic directly, to become, if only briefly, part of the system they sought to alter. The air thickened. The light shifted. And then the voices came. They did not emerge one by one, but all at once, overlapping, layered, and heavy with emotion so old and so deeply embedded that it struck not only the ears, but the chest, the breath, the very rhythm of thought. And though the words themselves were at first fractured and indistinct, their meaning pressed through with terrible clarity. Blood remembers. The phrase echoed through the chamber, not spoken by any single figure, but carried on the combined presence of those impressions hovering above the basin. And as the forms grew clearer, Elias felt his vision blur, not with darkness, but with images forced upon him, scenes not his own, memories not lived, yet delivered with such immediacy that they might as well have been. He saw a hall lit by torches and shadow, a gathering of robed figures standing in rigid formation, their faces drawn with anger and cold resolve, and at the center, a woman whose eyes burned with a fury sharpened into purpose, her voice rising as she spoke words that bound not only those present, but those yet unborn. You who take what is not yours, who sever blood for gain and call it justice, shall not escape what you have sown, for the line you carry shall carry the debt, and the power you hoard shall become your burden until it is returned. The vision shifted. Miriam gasped beside him, though whether she saw the same or something different, Elias could not tell, because the images came faster now, fragments of betrayal, of signatures upon parchment that condemned entire branches of family to ruin, of names erased, of properties seized, of children sent away under orders disguised as law, and beneath it all the steady, growing certainty that this curse had not been born from madness, but from calculated vengeance shaped into ritual. Theo's voice broke through, strained but present. "Do not let it pull you under," he said, though he spoke as much to himself as to the others, because the pressure of the visions threatened to overwhelm not only thought, but identity itself. Elias forced himself to focus, to hold to the present, to remember why they had come, and as he did, the words of the inscription returned to him with renewed force. Debt. Root. Branch. Recognition. "It is showing us the cause," he said, his voice barely audible against the layered voices of the chamber, "because the curse is built upon it." Miriam's hand trembled slightly against the basin, yet her voice, when she spoke, carried through the noise with sharp clarity. "Then we answer it," she said, not with denial, but with acknowledgement. Malfoy stepped closer, though he still did not touch the basin. "Careful," he warned. "Acknowledgement strengthens the binding if not directed properly." Elias closed his eyes, not to escape the visions, but to focus within them, to separate the structure of the curse from the emotion that fed it. Because if this was indeed a contract, then it required not only a trigger, but a response. And perhaps, just perhaps, that response could be shaped. "The curse demands recognition of the debt," he said slowly, "but it does not specify how that recognition must be given, only that it must be tied to blood." Theo's breathing steadied slightly. "So we give it recognition without surrendering power." Miriam's grip tightened. "We redefine the payment." The chamber reacted at once. The red glow flared violently, and the figures above the basin twisted as though disturbed, their forms stretching and collapsing into one another, while the voices rose into a sharp, discordant chorus that pressed against their thoughts with sudden resistance. Unpaid. Unyielded. Unbroken. The words struck like blows. Elias staggered but did not release the basin. "It resists," he said through clenched teeth, "because it expects surrender, not reinterpretation." Malfoy's voice cut through, sharper now. "Then give it what it expects, but not in the form it demands." Miriam's eyes opened, and there was a fierce clarity in them now that burned through the strain. "Symbolic equivalence," she said. "If we cannot deny the debt, we transform its fulfillment." Theo gave a strained, almost disbelieving laugh. "Transforming a blood curse mid-activation? Yes, of course. Perfectly reasonable." "Focus," Miriam snapped. though the urgency in her tone left no room for argument. We acknowledge the betrayal, we accept that the line carries the debt, but we redefine the loss as knowledge and remembrance rather than power stripped by force. Elias seized the idea at once. Memory instead of magic, he said, and the words, once spoken, seemed to settle into place with unexpected weight. The inheritance becomes burden through remembrance, not through depletion. The chamber stilled for a fraction of a second. Then the voices shifted. Not gone. Not silenced. But altered. Remember. The word echoed, softer than before, though no less present, and the figures above the basin changed, their forms less violent now, less distorted, as though the structure of the curse itself had recognized a variation in its fulfillment. Malfoy stepped closer still, his eyes fixed on the basin with intense focus. "Continue," he said. "It is listening." Elias drew in a breath that felt heavier than it should, then spoke again, not to the others, but into the chamber, into the binding itself. "The debt is acknowledged," he said, his voice steady despite the strain. "The betrayal is remembered, and the line does not deny what was done, but neither does it accept destruction as justice, for what was taken cannot be restored through further loss, only through recognition that endures." Miriam followed at once. "The inheritance remains," she said, "but it carries the weight of what came before, not as punishment, but as responsibility, to prevent the same harm from being done again." Theo, though still unsteady, added his voice. "The line is bound, not to suffering, but to memory, and through that memory the debt is held, not erased, but transformed." The chamber responded. The crimson light pulsed once, sharply, then faltered. The channels in the floor flickered, their glow weakening, while the figures above the basin shifted again, their forms less defined, their presence less oppressive, as though the curse itself had been forced into reconsideration, its rigid structure bending under the pressure of a new interpretation. But it did not yield completely. A final surge of resistance rose from the basin, stronger than before, as though the original binding fought to reassert itself, and the voices returned in a single, unified declaration that struck through the chamber like a blade. "Blood must pay." Elias felt the force of it slam into him, and for a moment his grip slipped, his strength faltering under the sheer weight of the demand, while Miriam gasped beside him, and Theo nearly lost his footing. The curse wasn't finished. It would not release them so easily. And as the red glow surged once more, brighter than ever, the chamber trembled with the final, unyielding insistence of a magic that had endured for centuries, without compromise, demanding its due with absolute certainty. The conflict had reached its breaking point, and whatever came next would decide not only whether the curse could be altered, but whether they would survive the attempt at all. For one suspended instant, the whole chamber seemed to hold itself upon the edge of a decision, not as a human mind decides, with hesitation and doubt, but as ancient magic decides when confronted by a force that presses against its oldest conditions, testing whether they may bend without breaking. And in that charged stillness, the crimson light hanging above the basin sharpened into a hard, throbbing brilliance that painted every carved pillar, every ancient groove in the floor, every strained face in violent red and black, while the final demand of the curse continued to echo through the stone, like a verdict that had been spoken too many times to imagine it could ever be refused. Blood must pay. The words were no longer merely heard, but felt, beating through Elias's bones with such force that for a moment his hands lost all sensation against the rim of the basin, and he understood then with sudden clarity that the magic before them wasn't only insisting on sacrifice as a principle, but attempting to reduce every possible answer to a single outcome, narrowing choice until surrender appeared to be the only shape resolution could take. And because that realization came at the exact moment his strength threatened to fail, it gave him, paradoxically, the very thing he needed most, namely resistance. "No," he said, though at first the word seemed almost swallowed by the chamber. The red glow surged as though in outrage. Beside him, Miriam drew a breath that trembled with pain, yet when she spoke, her voice cut far more sharply than the curse itself, not louder, but clearer. Because where the chamber carried force, she carried intention. "Blood has already paid," she said into the basin, every syllable deliberate, through exile, loss, fear, and generations burdened by what they never chose. Theo's head lifted at once, and though his face had gone gray with strain, something like fierce understanding flashed in his eyes, because the answer to an old injustice is not always denial, and not always obedience, but sometimes the exposing of a deeper truth than the one upon which vengeance built itself. "Yes," he said, his voice rough, yet growing steadier as he continued. "The debt was carried forward, precisely as intended, because descendants inherited the wound without inheriting the crime, which means the payment you demand has already been made through suffering that outlived the guilty." Whoa! At those words, the figures above the basin wavered, and for the first time, the gaunt woman whose face had formed most clearly among them seemed less like a wrathful shade and more like something caught between fury and listening, as though the structure of the ritual, built from her oath, had been forced to confront not an evasion of terms, but their fulfillment in a manner not previously named. Malfoy, who had remained rigid with concentration behind them, took one measured step closer, and when he spoke, there was nothing of pride in him, nor even the cold reserve he had worn since entering the chamber, but only the grave clarity of a man at last willing to set truth before dignity. "The line that benefited from betrayal has not gone unmarked," he said, and the chamber seemed to hear the weight of ancestry in him at once, for the red light bent toward his voice as though recognizing the blood from which it came. Because those of us born into its remnants inherited not triumph, but ruin of another kind, fear taught at the family table, shame unspoken yet present in every silence, and the knowledge that power preserved through treachery becomes a burden no air can hold without being altered by it. The basin pulsed. The words cut deeper than argument because they were not only interpretive, but personal, and in them lay the one element that cold ritual always struggles to contain, namely the fact that descendants are not abstractions, nor lines in a chart, nor extensions of their dead, but living people shaped and scarred by histories they did not author. The whispering changed. It did not cease, but loosened, splitting into currents no longer wholly united, and Elias felt the pressure against his chest shift from direct assault to unstable motion, as though the curse, so absolute only moments before, had begun to divide against itself. Still, it resisted. The channels in the floor flared again, and the figures above the basin blurred, then reformed in a harsher configuration, while the voice that emerged now seemed centered more fully through the gaunt woman than before, gaining shape enough to speak in a tone that was no less terrible for being calm. "Then let the inheritor choose," it said. The words struck the chamber like iron set into stone. At once the glow behind the basin deepened, and the cracked signet ring rose slowly from its recess without any hand touching it, hovering above the black basin in a circle of red-lit air, while below it the surface of the stone darkened until it became reflective, not like water, but like polished obsidian, and in that reflection, a new image formed. It was not the old hall of the oath, nor the ruined branch house, nor any fragment of memory from the original feud. It was Hogwarts. The great hall, dim beneath enchanted night, rows of empty tables stretching under floating candles, and at the center of the floor lay the students already taken by the curse, pale, motionless, diminished as though some vital brilliance had been drawn thin within them, while around them stood others, more and more with each passing breath, shapes flickering into view as potential futures hardened toward reality. Students from Slytherin, Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, Gryffindor, all linked not by house, but by the interwoven threads of old wizarding blood. Theo stared at the vision in horror. It is showing what comes next. "No," Malfoy said, and his voice had gone very quiet, which made it more alarming. "It is presenting terms." The face in the light turned, and though it was made from magic, memory, and oath rather than true living substance, Elias felt with chilling certainty that the woman now regarded them not as intruders, but as parties to the unfinished contract. "One line bears the gain," she said. "One line shall yield the power, and the debt shall close." Miriam's fingers dug harder into the basin. "So that is the choice you offer," she said, and there was steel in her voice despite the exhaustion pulling at every breath. "Continued harm to many, or sacrifice from one descended line." The figure did not answer in new words, yet the hovering ring brightened in clear confirmation. Elias looked toward Malfoy. For the briefest instant neither spoke, because some truths arrive before language does, and both of them understood at once what the chamber meant, what line it had identified as the inheritor most directly connected to the gain preserved from the betrayal, and how cruelly precise ancient magic could be when seeking a vessel through which to conclude its own design. Malfoy understood too. He set his cane aside. It fell against the stone with a hard, lonely sound that seemed far louder than it should have been. "No," Elias said immediately, because the motion alone was enough. Malfoy did not look at him. "If the chamber requires a descendant of the inheriting branch to yield part of the bound power, then among those present the clearest claimant is mine." Theo shook his head sharply. "You do not even know what will remain of your magic if you do that." "I know enough," Malfoy replied. Miriam turned toward him with exhausted fury. "That is not a solution. It is surrender to the original form of the curse after all we have forced it to reconsider." At that, he finally looked at her, and there was in his expression something hard, but not unkind. "You forced it to reconsider justice," he said, "not consequence, and there is a difference." Elias felt anger surge through the fatigue. "And you think that means you must let it take from you because your name happens to sit closest to the old line?" "My name," Malfoy said, "and my blood." The ring spun once in the air above the basin, and the reflective surface below darkened further, sharpening the vision of the stricken students, until it became unbearable to look at, because each moment of delay seemed to draw another faint body onto the floor of that spectral great hall. Then, through the pressure, the weakness, and the oppressive insistence of the chamber, another thought came to Elias with sudden force, not born of fear, but of structure, and he turned so quickly back to the basin that pain flashed through his chest. "No," he said again, though this time not in protest but in realization. It said 1 line bears the gain, 1 line shall yield the power, but it did not name a single person. Malfoy frowned slightly. Miriam's eyes sharpened at once. Theo understood half a breath later. "The line," Miriam said slowly, "not the air." Theo straightened despite obvious effort. Shared dissent, shared acknowledgement, shared surrender. Elias nodded, the idea clarifying even as he spoke it. If the debt has been carried by many descendants, then the relinquishing need not fall upon one alone, because the contract binds a line across generations, not a single body, which means the required yielding may be divided among all living claimants connected through the same network. Malfoy stared at him. "You are suggesting dispersal?" "Yes," Elias replied. "Not enough from one person to maim their magic, but a minimal release from every linked line the chamber recognizes here and now, sufficient to satisfy the symbolic condition without destroying anyone." Miriam turned back to the basin, her voice gaining strength with each word. "A distributed payment. The debt acknowledged across the branches that inherited its consequences, and closed by collective yielding rather than singular ruin." Theo gave a breath that was almost a laugh, though strained nearly to breaking. "Which is also far more just." The red light around the ring flickered violently, and for a moment the chamber seemed to resist with renewed force, because old vengeance prefers concentration, prefers the drama of one heir broken beneath history. Yet the logic of the contract had been spoken aloud, and once named, it could not easily be unmade. The figure above the basin wavered. The students in the vision flickered. Malfoy's expression changed not into relief, but into the wary focus of a man who sees a narrow bridge appear where seconds earlier there had only been a precipice. "It may work," he said, almost unwillingly. "It must," Miriam answered. The woman-shaped presence drew itself taller in the air. The whispering rose around her like dry leaves in wind, and then the chamber spoke again, though now the voice carried strain within its certainty, as though the oath itself were being forced to expand, then let the bound declare themselves. Ayo! At once the grooves in the floor burst into branching lines of crimson that spread outward from the basin like roots seeking soil, not through stone alone, but through recognition, through ancestry, through every living thread the chamber could still touch, and Elias understood with sudden dread and wonder that the next step would demand not only courage within this hidden room, but the unwitting participation of everyone above who carried even the faintest connection to the old blood-bound feud. Somewhere in Hogwarts, the descendants were being called. And before the night ended, the castle itself would answer. What followed the chamber's declaration did not resemble any ordinary summoning known within the common disciplines of Hogwarts magic, because no visible flare shot upward through stone, no bells rang, no portrait cried alarm, and yet the whole castle seemed to take one slow inward breath, as though some hidden current had begun moving through its foundations, rising from the buried chamber by ways older than staircases and corridors, traveling not along corridors of stone, but along the subtle unseen channels through which ancient enchantments once joined the castle to those who lived within it. And as the crimson branches spread outward from the basin in every direction, vanishing into wall and floor alike, Elias felt with sudden certainty that the call had gone forth not to ears, but to blood, to the deep, quiet inheritance that lay sleeping in students who had never imagined that forgotten alliances, marriages, betrayals, and names preserved only in genealogies could ever reach up from the past and lay claim to the present. Above them, In the sleeping and waking chambers of Hogwarts, candles flickered without drafts, windows rattled though no wind pressed against them, and students who only moments before had been speaking, studying, or lying awake with private worries felt, many of them at once, a strange pause within themselves, a sensation difficult to describe later except as a brief pulling beneath the ribs, as though they had all, for one impossible instant, remembered something they had never been taught. In the hospital wing, the afflicted stirred. Madame Pomfrey, who had spent the evening moving from bed to bed with the increasing frustration of one confronted by a magic that refused every ordinary remedy, stopped so abruptly beside a Hufflepuff sixth year that the bottle in her hand knocked softly against the frame. Because the student's breathing had changed, not worsening, but deepening. And along the skin of his wrist there appeared for a moment a faint thread of red light beneath the surface, delicate as a vein glimpsed through candlelight, before it faded again. At the same time, in her office high above the grounds, Minerva McGonagall looked up from the old records spread across her desk, her sharp gaze narrowing as the fire in the grate bent suddenly sideways without cause, then straightened again. And though she did not yet know what had happened beneath the castle, the instinct shaped by long years of guarding Hogwarts told her with cold precision that the hidden crisis had reached a new stage, not in secrecy any longer, but in activation. And she rose at once, her chair scraping back across the floor, before striding from the office with the kind of speed that made portraits flatten themselves against their frames rather than obstruct her path. Below, in the chamber, the crimson lines continued to pulse. They spread from the basin, along the carved channels, through the pillars, beneath the floor, and outward into the unseen fabric of Hogwarts, until the whole room seemed to stand at the center of a web pulled taut from hundreds of old living threads. And with each pulse, the hovering ring above the basin spun more slowly, more deliberately, as if waiting for the response the chamber had demanded. "Will they know what is happening?" Theo asked, and though his voice was steadier than before, it carried the raw edge of someone who had already given more strength than he could afford, and yet understood that the hardest part remained before them. "No," Malfoy said, his eyes fixed on the branching light. "Not consciously, but the chamber is not asking for intention, only acknowledgement through presence, because the descendants need not understand the old debt for the old debt to understand them." Miriam, whose face had grown paler still under the red illumination, turned slightly toward him. "Then how does collective yielding work if those above have no idea they are being called to it?" Malfoy did not answer at once, and in that small hesitation there was something revealing, namely that even he, who knew more of this chamber than any of them, had not been forced to solve this exact question before now. Elias looked back toward the basin, toward the floating ring and the obsidian dark surface below it, where the vision of the great hall still glimmered, though less sharply than before, as if awaiting the next condition, and the answer came to him not as full certainty, but as the shape of the only possible path left open by the chamber's own logic. "It has to be declared here," he said, "because this room is the point of recognition, and if the chamber has called the bound lines into awareness, however faintly, then the terms must be spoken from the center of the binding, so the response can travel outward through what it has awakened." Miriam followed the thought at once. "Like an oath answered by another oath." "Yes," Elias replied, "not to erase the first, but to close it under altered terms." Theo drew in a breath and looked toward the ring. "Then the declaration has to be precise," he said, "because if we leave room for the curse to interpret it in the harshest way, it will." "That," Malfoy said quietly, "is the truest thing anyone has yet said in this chamber." The whispering rose again, though not now in direct assault, but encircling tension, as if the ancient figures suspended above the basin were drawing nearer to hear whether those living below had understood the rules well enough to challenge them without breaking under them. And among the wavering forms, the gaunt woman remained the clearest, her expression severe, wounded, and unyielding, though not entirely deaf to what had already been spoken. Elias stood straighter, despite the exhaustion dragging at his body, because he knew that if they were to attempt this, hesitation would only hand the advantage back to the curse. "The line bore gain," he said slowly, as though testing the wording upon the air itself. "The branches bore consequence, and the descendants now bear knowledge. Therefore the debt is neither denied nor escaped, but shared among those joined by the old binding." The basin pulsed once. Miriam stepped in before the echo faded. "No one branch alone shall be destroyed for what many carried forward, because the oath bound root and branch together, and what was bound together shall also be released together." The crimson grooves along the floor flickered, then steadied. Theo added his voice, his words precise despite the strain. "Let each living line recognized by this chamber yield the smallest measure required for closure, no more than acknowledgement made manifest, no less than truth given form, so that the debt ends without false innocence and without renewed cruelty." This time the ring halted in the air. For one suspended heartbeat, everything in the chamber grew still. Then the surface of the basin changed. The reflected great hall vanished, replaced by a darkness so deep that it appeared almost bottomless, and from within that darkness rose new lights, faint at first, then multiplying, dozens of them, perhaps more, each no larger than a spark. And Elias understood that these were not stars, nor embers, but lives, the living descendants touched by the chamber's call, scattered throughout Hogwarts above them, glowing where the curse had found kinship of blood. The woman-shaped presence lifted one hand. "Who speaks for the inheriting line?" The chamber asked through her, and the question entered the room with such absolute force that none could mistake its purpose, because however collective the release might become, the altered terms still required a voice from the branch most directly linked to the preserved gain, one who would not merely propose the distribution, but accept it openly before the oath. Malfoy closed his eyes for the briefest moment. When he opened them again, the hesitation that had marked him earlier was gone, not because fear had left him, but because fear had become irrelevant. "I do," he said. At once the nearest crimson line rose from the floor and wrapped itself around his wrist like living thread, not cutting, not burning, but sealing recognition so complete that even Theo took a half step forward in alarm. Malfoy did not flinch. "I speak as descendant of the inheriting branch," he continued. His voice level, though the light tightened against his skin, "and I declare the debt acknowledged, the gain unhidden, and the burden accepted as shared among those whom the old oath still binds." The chamber listened. No other words suited what happened then, because the tension in the room shifted from hostility to judgment, as if the ancient magic were measuring not whether he meant what he said, but whether lineage itself, through him, had at last ceased pretending innocence. The woman's face sharpened further. "Will the line yield?" she asked. Malfoy answered without pause. "It will." The crimson thread around his wrist brightened, and throughout the darkness inside the basin, the scattered living sparks answered, each flaring once in distant sympathetic light, as though the descendants above, sleeping or waking, frightened or unaware, had all been touched by the same invisible recognition, and had, at some level below conscious thought, become part of what was unfolding. But the chamber was not finished. "What yield is given?" it asked. Elias felt dread tighten in him again, because this was the point where all their careful reasoning might yet fail if the answer came too vague, too broad, or too weak for the oath to accept. And he opened his mouth to speak. Yet Miriam was first, her voice sharp as a spell cast in darkness. "Not power taken in punishment," she said, "but inheritance marked by remembrance." Theo followed instantly. "Not ruin of one life to satisfy dead rage, but shared lessening, slight and equal, enough to close the debt and leave the memory." Elias stepped closer to the basin and added the final piece, sensing rather than knowing that it must be this, that the terms required not only structure, but meaning. Let each bound line surrender one trace of ancestral pride, one fragment of blood-born claim that serves vanity rather than virtue, and let the debt end there, with memory remaining and harm concluded. The chamber shook. Not violently, but profoundly, as if some vast hidden mechanism had shifted after centuries locked in one merciless position, and every crimson thread in the room flared at once, including the one around Malfoy's wrist, while the sparks in the basin blazed brighter until they resembled a constellation caught beneath black glass. The woman's expression changed. Not into peace. Not into forgiveness. But into something closer to release. Then, with a sound like stone exhaling after ages under pressure, the chamber began to answer. And high above, throughout Hogwarts, students stopped mid-step, mid-breath, mid-dream, as the ancient oath reached out to take from each of them not life, not strength, but something subtler and stranger. Some inherited glimmer carried unknowingly from the old bloodlines into the present. The yielding had begun. And none of them yet knew whether the chamber would be satisfied before it took more than they had meant to give. The moment the yielding began, it did not resemble loss in any ordinary sense, because no visible wound appeared, no cry of pain rose from the castle above, and yet within the chamber the change was immediate and undeniable, for the countless sparks suspended within the basin trembled all at once, each flaring briefly before dimming by the smallest degree, as though something delicate and intangible had been drawn from them. Not violently, but with a measured precision that spoke of ancient rules finally being obeyed in a new form. Elias felt it within himself as well. It was not weakness, not the draining force that had earlier pressed upon his chest with suffocating insistence, but rather a quiet shift. Like the loosening of a thread he had never known was tied to him, and though he could not have named what had been taken, he knew with a strange and sober certainty that something subtle yet real had been relinquished, something bound not to his skill nor to his memory, but to the inherited sense of belonging to a lineage whose weight he had only now begun to understand. Beside him, Miriam inhaled sharply, her hand tightening once against the rim of the basin before easing, and when she spoke, her voice carried not pain, but recognition. "It is not harming us," she said, her eyes fixed on the shifting lights within the dark surface. "It is taking only what we offered, no more." Theo gave a strained but steady nod, as though confirming the same within himself. "Something small," he said, "yet tied to something larger, as if a piece of history has been unbound from us." Malfoy did not speak at once, though the crimson thread around his wrist pulsed more brightly than any of the others, marking him still as the primary anchor through which the chamber measured the act. And for a moment Elias feared that despite their attempt at distribution, the curse might yet draw too deeply from him. Yet when Malfoy finally exhaled, the sound was controlled, not broken, and the tension in his posture eased by a fraction that would have been invisible to anyone not watching closely. "It is working," he said quietly. The chamber responded. The red light that had until now burned with harsh intensity began to soften, not fading entirely, but shifting into a steadier glow that no longer lashed outward with hostility, while the whispering voices diminished from a layered pressure into something more distant, like echoes receding through stone, and the figure of the gaunt woman above the basin. Once rigid with fury, now appeared less defined, her features loosening as though the force that had held them so sharply together had begun to release its grip. Yet still the process continued. The sparks within the basin dimmed one by one, not extinguished, but altered, and Elias understood that each represented a living descendant touched by the old oath, each contributing in that moment the smallest portion of what the curse required. And though the taking was gentle, the sheer number of those connected made the effect profound, because what had once demanded the breaking of one line was now being satisfied by the shared acknowledgement of many. Miriam leaned slightly closer to the basin, her voice low but urgent. "How long will it continue?" Malfoy's gaze did not leave the hovering ring. "Until the chamber determines that the terms have been fulfilled," he said, "and that depends on whether the distributed yield reaches the threshold originally defined by the ritual." Theo frowned. "And if it does not?" Malfoy did not answer immediately, and the silence that followed carried enough meaning on its own. Elias felt the pressure within his chest begin to ease, the earlier draining sensation replaced by a steadier, lighter awareness. And for the first time since entering the chamber, he was able to draw a full breath without effort. Yet even as relief threatened to take hold, he forced himself to remain focused, because this was not yet the end, and ancient magic rarely surrendered its purpose without testing the outcome one final time. The ring above the basin flickered. At first the movement was slight, almost uncertain, but then it spun once, sharply, and the crimson thread around Malfoy's wrist tightened, not painfully, but with renewed insistence, as though the chamber were measuring the remaining difference between what had been given and what had once been demanded. The sparks dimmed further. The light along the channels faltered. Then, abruptly, everything stopped. The chamber fell into a stillness so complete that even the faintest sound seemed magnified, and for one suspended heartbeat, Elias feared that the attempt had failed at the final moment, that the distributed yielding had come close but not close enough, and that the curse would now snap back to its original demand with greater force than before. The figure above the basin raised her head. Where once her expression had been fixed in anger, it now held something far more complex, not forgiveness, for such a thing lay beyond the nature of what she had become, but recognition, as though the logic of the altered terms had reached a point she could not deny, even if she could not fully embrace it. "The debt is answered," the chamber said through her, and the words fell not as a concession, but as a conclusion drawn from the rules themselves. At once the crimson thread around Malfoy's wrist dissolved into light. The ring dropped from its suspended position, striking the basin with a dull, final sound before settling into stillness. The channels along the floor darkened, their glow extinguished not by force, but by completion. And the sparks within the basin flared one last time before fading into a quiet, steady darkness that no longer pulsed with demand. The curse had ended. For a long moment, none of them moved, because the shift from tension to release was so sudden that it left behind a strange emptiness, like the silence after a storm that has passed too quickly to be believed, and Elias found himself staring at his own hands, half expecting to see some visible sign of what had been taken, though of course there was none. Only the faint awareness of something no longer present, something he would likely never fully understand, yet would always, in some quiet way, remember. Miriam was the first to straighten fully, drawing a deeper breath than she had managed in some time, while Theo lowered his wand at last, his shoulders sagging with exhaustion that had been held at bay until the very moment it was no longer needed. Malfoy stepped back from the basin, retrieving his cane with a movement that was slower than before, though not unsteady. And when he looked toward the three students, there was no triumph in his expression. Only a sober acknowledgement of what had been done and what it had cost. "It is finished," he said. Elias nodded, though his gaze remained on the basin, where the black stone now lay inert, its surface dull, its inscriptions dark, as though the terrible purpose it had once carried had been drained from it along with the power that sustained it. "For us," he said quietly. Miriam turned toward him. "You think there is more?" Elias lifted his eyes to the chamber around them, to the pillars, the faded symbols, the ancient marks left by those who had built this place long before any of them had been born. "No curse like this disappears without leaving something behind," he said. And though his voice was calm, there was in it a certainty that none of the others could easily dismiss. Theo gave a tired, almost rueful smile. "After everything we have just done, I would be more surprised if it ended cleanly." Malfoy said nothing, yet the brief narrowing of his eyes suggested that he too understood that ancient magic rarely concluded without consequence, even when its primary function had been fulfilled. Above them, the castle stirred. In the hospital wing, students opened their eyes. In the corridors, the strange tension that had lingered all day began to lift. And in McGonagall's swift approach through the lower halls, there came the unmistakable sense that what had been hidden was about to be brought into the light. The curse was broken, but its legacy had not yet finished shaping the lives of those who had stood at its heart. The silence that followed the extinguishing of the curse did not feel empty, but complete, as though something vast and tightly wound had at last uncoiled beneath the castle and withdrawn into a stillness that no longer pressed against the living. And yet within that stillness there lingered a faint echo, not of danger, but of memory, like the last trace of a voice long after it has ceased to speak, reminding those who heard it that it had once been real and would not be forgotten simply because it had ended. Elias stepped back from the basin at last, his body heavy with exhaustion, yet steadier than it had been since they first entered the chamber, and when he turned his head slightly, he saw that Miriam and Theo bore the same mixture of relief and quiet unease, because though they had succeeded in altering the course of something ancient and merciless, they had done so not by destroying it, but by forcing it to acknowledge a truth it had not been designed to accept. And such victories, though real, often carried consequences that revealed themselves only with time. From the corridor beyond came the unmistakable sound of footsteps, swift, controlled, and utterly unhesitating, and before any of them could speak, the figure of Minerva McGonagall appeared at the threshold, her presence filling the chamber not through force, but through authority so absolute that even the lingering shadows seemed to retreat slightly before it. And though her expression was as composed as ever, there was in her eyes a sharpness that spoke of both concern and anger held in precise balance. She took in the scene at once. The darkened basin, the extinguished channels, the four figures standing within a place no student should have found. and Draco Malfoy. "Mr. Malfoy," she said. And though her tone was measured, it carried the unmistakable edge of someone who already knew more than she had yet been told. "I believe you have an explanation to offer, and I trust it will be both immediate and complete." Malfoy inclined his head slightly, not in defiance, but in acknowledgement of authority that he did not intend to challenge, and for a moment Elias wondered what it must feel like to stand where he stood, not as a student summoned for discipline, but as the one who had set in motion the very crisis now brought under control. "You are correct, Headmistress," Malfoy said, his voice calm despite the weight of what he must say, "and I will provide it without omission." McGonagall's gaze shifted briefly to the three students, and though her expression softened by the smallest degree, the concern within it was unmistakable. "Are you injured?" she asked. "No," Miriam answered, though her voice carried the strain of someone who had come very close to a different outcome. "Not in any lasting way." Theo gave a faint nod. "The affected students should recover as well." Elias added quietly, "The curse has been broken." At that, McGonagall's attention returned fully to the basin, and for a moment she said nothing, her sharp mind clearly tracing the implications of what lay before her, because though she had not witnessed the events within the chamber, she understood enough of magic, of history, and of human folly to recognize that something both dangerous and extraordinary had taken place beneath her school. "Then we will ensure that it remains so," she said at last, and with a precise movement she drew her wand, not to threaten, but to begin the careful process of sealing what should never again be left accessible. Malfoy stepped aside without protest, and as McGonagall moved toward the basin, her wand tracing controlled, deliberate arcs through the air, the chamber responded not with resistance, but with a quiet acceptance. As though the ancient structure itself had no further purpose now that its binding had been fulfilled and its demand resolved under new terms. Stone shifted. Not violently, but with a deep, grinding finality, as hidden seams within the walls closed and the entrance behind them began to seal, the passage narrowing, the light beyond dimming, until the chamber itself seemed to draw inward, retreating from the world above and returning to the long sleep from which it had been disturbed. "Such places," McGonagall said, more to herself than to them, "are relics of a time when magic was practiced with far less restraint, and it is a mistake we must not repeat to leave them within reach of those who do not yet understand the cost of what they touch." Her gaze flicked briefly toward Malfoy, not accusingly, but with a clarity that required no further explanation. He met it without flinching. "I am aware of that cost now," he said quietly. McGonagall studied him for a moment longer, then inclined her head by the smallest degree, as though acknowledging not absolution, but understanding, before turning back to complete the final sealing enchantments that would ensure the chamber remained inaccessible to all but the most deliberate and controlled intervention. When at last she lowered her wand, the air within the room had changed completely. The oppressive weight was gone. The whispering had ceased. And the basin, once the heart of a deadly oath, now stood as nothing more than inert stone, its purpose ended. "Come," McGonagall said, her voice returning to its familiar, firm calm. "You will all accompany me, and we will see to the recovery of those affected and the proper accounting of what has occurred here." They did not argue. They did not linger. For though curiosity still lingered at the edges of their thoughts, it was tempered now by the understanding that some answers, once found, did not need to be revisited again. As they made their way back through the narrowing passage, the stone closing behind them with slow and silent certainty, Elias felt the strange absence within himself more clearly. That small, relinquished fragment of something inherited, something tied to a lineage he had never chosen yet, had carried nonetheless. And though its loss was real, it did not feel like damage, but like release, as if a thread too tightly wound had finally been loosened. Beside him, Miriam walked with quiet composure, her thoughts already turning, perhaps, to how such magic could have been allowed to exist, and how it might be prevented in the future. While Theo, though visibly exhausted, carried in his expression the unmistakable spark of someone who had witnessed something profound and would spend years trying to understand every part of it. Malfoy followed slightly behind them, his pace measured, his face unreadable, yet there was, in the set of his shoulders, something altered, something less burdened than before, as though the weight of an inherited shadow had been lifted not entirely, but enough to allow him to stand more freely within it. When they emerged once more into the familiar corridors of Hogwarts, the castle felt different. Not safer, exactly, but clearer. The students they passed looked up as they went, unaware of what had transpired beneath their feet, yet no longer carrying the faint unease that had lingered earlier. And in the distance, the sound of voices returning to ordinary life rose once more, steady and untroubled. The curse was gone. The debt, at last, had been answered. And though the past could never be undone, it had been faced, reshaped, and brought to a conclusion that did not demand the destruction of the living to satisfy the anger of the dead. That night, as Hogwarts settled again into its quiet rhythms, the castle held within its walls one more story, hidden from most, yet carried by a few who would remember not only the danger they had faced, but the choice they had made, a choice that had turned an ancient demand for blood into a shared act of remembrance, and in doing so had changed, in some small but lasting way, the nature of what it meant to inherit the past.
Ну що ж, друзі, давайте поговоримо про момент, коли Еліас, Міріам і Тео відмовилися прийняти старі правила прокляття як єдину можливу правду. Вони могли просто погодитися з тим, що минуле, а все ж все-таки вирішило за них. Але натомість наші герої наважилися поставити запитання самому закону, який існував століттями. І здається, що саме тут ховається справжній сенс цієї історії. Протягом усієї людської історії люди сперечалися з однією тією ж самою думкою. Чи повинні діти платити за помилки своїх предків? У міфах, легендах і навіть в реальному житті ми часто бачимо, як старі образи, страхи чи конфлікти переходять від покоління до покоління. Але історія під Хогвартсом нагадує нам важливу річ. Ми не завжди можемо змінити те, що сталося коли. Зате можемо вирішити, що робити з цією спадщиною сьогодні. Не кожен борг потрібно сплачувати новим болем. Іноді справжня мудрість полягає в тому, щоб пам'ятати минуле, не дозволяючи йому керувати майбутнім. Мабуть, саме тоді старі прокляття, магічні чи цілком людські, нарешті втратять свою силу. Дякую всім за увагу. До нових зустрічей.